How's it going, YouTube? Quentin today with another video, and today, guys, what the video is going to be Word to Handtrap, and this is going to be the Dictionary Edition. As you can see, I'm pretty cozy. It's 12:30 at night, so definitely feel free to go ahead and grab your hot chocolate or your popcorn, since today is going to be a very long video, and it's going to be the dictionary. So it's your one-stop shop for everything that you need to know in the format, and it's even going to have the odds and ends in there too that you're like, wow, I forgot about that. It's really good to know. So these videos are absolutely 110% my flagship series, and they're so much fun. And with the new series that are coming out on my channel, I do love the new support already on those too. That just means that I'm doing the right thing and the videos are doing really well and that you are all really enjoying the content. And that means a lot to me, because I want to make sure that I can make an impact on everyone and really make sure that you know how to improve and where your spots are to hand trap, where your spots are to improve your technical play. That's what my channel is built on, and I cannot tell you how much it means to me when someone comes up to me and they're like, your videos helped me get my invite. Your videos helped me top an event. That's so cool, and I so am appreciative that I get to be the one to do that. So thank you all from the bottom of my heart for giving me the opportunity to make sure that I can keep on helping you all out every single video. If you haven't already checked my sponsors over at Imperium Duelist, Dragonshield, Gem, Cloud, RW, or Grimoire, definitely go ahead and do so, all down below in the description. And if you have not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel. Let's hit 30,000 as soon as possible and keep blowing out our milestones. I appreciate you all. I'm your host, GG, and let's hop into Where to Handtrap. Now, Yubel is a deck that fell off pretty hard because of one Phantom of Yubel. The card was really impactful for the deck, and the fact that we can't use extra copies to combo now is really awkward. So the deck itself has fallen off quite a bit. It does not mean the deck is absolutely terrible, but it definitely has a lot to do right now in terms of catching up to the format. So you can use a Bishul on like Engraver if you don't want to deal with a Desiree or a Caesar. If they're just making Desiree and not a Caesar, then it's fine. You can just wait if you have Rock in hand and just use Rock. But if you are worried about the Caesar, you can always go ahead and get rid of the Engraver. Alternatively, if you only have Rock and you get into a situation where they have like Princess and Engraver, then you'll just go ahead and Rock here to make sure your opponent can't get to Caesar. This is another thing that you'll see in quite a few slides, and that's exactly what I'm referring to. Just the Rock stops the Caesar at this point, right? So you also can use your Bishul to go ahead and just get rid of the Squirmer and Grave, which is really important too, because you want to make sure that you shut off a lot of options for your opponent to be able to extend further, making things like their Verudgerous, and this card is just so absurd, being able to get so much free value. So definitely another one that's really good to hit. Same with Ogre. I feel like this is another card that's really impactful in this matchup because you always want to hit Nightmare Pain. There's always a couple options though where your opponent will use like opening the Spirit Gates to revive. They'll like pitch one to Reborn, and you can just go ahead and Ogre the opening as well. But it's almost always just Nightmare Pain though, especially because you're going to be using Moonlit, your Veilers, your Imperms to just hit Spirit of Yubel to prevent the Nightmare Pain from even hitting the board. That card is so absurd and it does way too many things to the deck, so you want to make sure that you cut off access to that as soon as possible. So negate the Yubel, do not negate the Samsara. You are going to Ash the Samsara. Do not Veiler Impermit in case they can bring it back. You also can just Ash Tract if you are worried about the Fiendsmith engine. And then last but not least, you can go ahead and Bell the Squirmer effect to summon, or you can just go ahead and Bell the effect of Engraver to come back to the board, again, if you are worried about that Caesar or a Desiree. Now, I'm going to need you to lock in with me on this one, because Maliss, there is a lot to go over. This deck is very complicated, and a lot of people are having a huge issue with this deck. Now, if you don't open Lancia, what do? And we're going to be talking about a lot here. The first thing I want to mention is that we are getting Mewals, which is going to be the new Mulcharmy against this deck. It's absurd. Your opponent is going to be in a really rough time if they do not have an answer for this Mulcharmy. So, you have Lancia, you have Mewals, you do have a fighting chance against this deck, and you will have 6 cards. Yes, this card is going to be a secret in the new set, but if you're that worried about Maliss, maybe it's worth it. The other question I get a lot is, do you droll Maliss? Now, there's a lot of times where a droll literally doesn't matter. There's a lot of times where your opponent does add quite a few times, or they draw off things like a lore quite a few times, and they get like the draw off the binder, they get a lot of free advantage. So at that point, it's like, do you droll this deck? You probably don't. I'd be playing literally anything else for the most part. Things like Ulti Slayer even, just make sure you can out the Teraherb. But Droll could be very good. You just have to make sure that you're paying attention to what kind of build the Maliss player is playing. Because if they're playing like Maliss Fiendsmith, it could be worth it, because at that point they go for like the Engraver search, they get tracked and now they're drolled. That hurts. Or if they are playing like a really heavy like microcoder, silent mining allure build, then yeah, Droll is going to do a lot of work. But if they're not, then don't put in Droll, put in anything else, right? So pay attention to what they're playing, pay attention to their build, and don't just auto scoop game one if it's not going your way. You want to get that information. So I have a really interesting thought process right now against this matchup. So the biggest conversation at the moment is, where do you bell Maliss? Some people say it's GWC. I say you hit the effect of Whitebinder on summon, because if your opponent has a Bishul, they will still make sure that the binder gets banished, and that's a problem. So at that point, if you just let the binder get summoned and then bell the effect of binder on board, I think that's a lot better, because if you go ahead and stop the effect to banish, you stop the White Rabbit from getting banished, which means no MTP. You stop the Ransom getting banished, and if they have a Crypter engraved, you stop that from getting banished as well. So that's really important. You don't let them load up their banish zone for even the Crypter effect. The other thing is that if you have a early Bishul, and let's say your opponent has a White Rabbit engrave before they pass, make sure that you use the Bishul to get rid of the White Rabbit and let it be banished, so when you get to your opponent's turn, they have to find a way back to Rabbit, because if they don't, then they're not going to have access to MTP because they set it during your turn, so they can use it during your turn. So if you can clear their grave of rabbits and make sure that you bell the effect of Whitebinder on summon, not only do you protect your own graveyard, you also protect the interruption from the MTP. You do want to drop Rock end of main onto the Teraherb, or just Ogre the Teraherb on the effect of Teraherb, because it's going to be very important moving forward to not have to worry about something like Disabler, Mirror Logic, Packbit. These are cards that are very problematic, so make sure that you get rid of this card as soon as possible. Now, you also can just hold Ash for Book of Eclipse, because the deck is notorious for maining it. So if you are worried about your end board or playing into their board and you see a lot of back row, you could just hold something like Ash for an Eclipse. You also could just Ash the MTP and just not worry about the issue at hand, right? So that's another alternative option. I also believe that it could be completely correct to just go ahead and Ash the Red Ransom. I already feel like it's 100% correct to Moonlit Chill, Veiler, or Imperm the Red Ransom, because especially if you have Nib in hand, you keep them off Field Spell. The Field Spell is going to be the last thing that your Maliss opponent will use to try and play through Nibiru as much as possible. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that your opponent is going to try to bluff set and normal summon something like Dormouse out and use the effect. I'm hitting that with a Veiler or an Imperm, or if it was special summoned, all day. All day. Because the only traps that they can flip are MTP or TB11. It can't be GWC, because if it's the beginning of the turn, there's nothing they can bring back. So they had a hard open 1 of 2 cards in 40 cards, and the likelihood of that are less than drawing a shifter at 3. So that is really important to know, that as scared as a lot of people are of shifter, you have to be even less scared about a real trap being set with one of these. And, you know, that's just the risk that you take. If they go set Imperm, normal Dormouse, and that's the way to start their combo, and you Veiler it and they pass, pretty crazy, right? So I'm taking that chance like 99% of the time, because again, they can only draw 1 of 2 to dodge. So that's really important as well. You can also bell the field spell, which is really nice. That's something where if you know that your opponent's trying to combo back into the turn, let's say that you go ahead and stop something and it puts them in a weird spot and they want to make sure that they can get back to a monster or like a Link, and they activate Underground, you can just bell Underground and the whole card would be sent to the graveyard because it activates on the activation. Therefore, when you bell, you negate the activation and send it to the graveyard. Now, when you play against Ryzeal Fiendsmith and you see an Engraver game 1 and you don't know what you're playing against, this is going to be extremely important because it could be Fiendsmith Tenpai or Fiendsmith Kashtira. So you don't know, and you have to treat it like you don't know. So game 1, I usually interact with the Fiendsmith cards because, again, especially if you have something like Nibiru or you have cards that you can play through just about anything with, right? It is nice to go ahead and just like Ash Attract. You Bishel away Engraver Engrave. You nib when they have Necroquip and the Engraver on board trying to go for a Caesar. These are all very important things that you really want to make sure that you keep in mind against the Fiendsmith engine. And you see the Caesar up here on the Bell, and I really like Bell against the Ryzeal Fiendsmith matchup. And if you're playing Ryzeal Fiendsmith, I like to play Bell because if you have Bell, you definitely guarantee yourself to make sure that your opponent is not going to use a Bishul. Because if you are trying to set up a Caesar and your opponent tries to Bishul away your Engraver and you Bell the Bishul and you're able to make the Caesar, then your opponent's Bishul is almost just completely irrelevant. So that's one thing where you want to keep that in mind, where playing Bell is actually a really crazy card for you because you're able to set up the Caesar to turn off Bishuls completely. The other thing is Bell onto the Lacrima effect to try to bring back the Requiem to go for Paradise is really popular. You can Bell the Twins of the Eclipse post Suda, or you can go ahead and just Bell the Engraver. I still really like using Bell for the most part. If I feel like I can't out a Caesar, then I'll just go ahead and stop the Engraver. If I'm playing and I have a Bell in my hand and the board's like manageable, I'll probably just save the Bell for the Lacrima so I don't have to deal with the Paradise. Because at that point, you kind of just know that you're going to trade 1-for-1 anyway. If you already have a plan otherwise for the Paradise, like let's say that you have a Bishul, then obviously you can just like Bishul the Requiem when they try to bring it back. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about this, but I really do like Bell in this matchup, and I also like playing Bell in the deck, because again, you do shut off the 1-for-1 for Paradise, or you can shut off things like Twins of the Eclipse, or just the Fiendsmith engine altogether. But the second that you know that this is Ryzeal Fiendsmith, the second you know this, okay, your hand traps immediately have to go to Duo Drive. If you have your opponent summon a sequence, and that you sequence effect, and the only card that you have in hand is an Imperm, sadly, you have to just hit the sequence, because otherwise, your Imperm was never doing anything. So, that's really important. You also could hold it for your turn if you have, like, Imperm Ogre, and then you could Imperm Detonator. The chance that they go ahead and just use Desiree to go ahead and negate the Imperm, and then you chain the Ogre to stop the Desiree, and then they cross negate. Now you just baited everything out except the Detonator, which is real crazy. So there's a few different ways that you can use your hand traps to just really trade well, and at that point you want to make sure that you're using your hand traps optimally. And, you know, the Duo Drive is the biggest one in my opinion. If your opponent has a Caesar or a Desiree, it does not matter if you have a Ash, an Ogre, a Moonlit, or a Veiler, right? These are cards you just need to save for the Duo Drive. Even if they're the only card that you open, you save them for the Duo Drive. I cannot stress this enough. Unless you cannot play through a Caesar, you hit the Duo Drive. Because at that point, unless they have an extender in hand, it's really awkward and they have to use a lot of resources to just make a detonator after you stop a Duo Drive. So that's one thing where if you are in that predicament, you can just say, okay, I'd rather just deal with a Caesar than everything else and just hit Duo. But hit Duo, please. Now, for Red Dragon Archfiend, if you run into this deck is pretty scary to a point. There's a lot of different variants of it. One of the ones that you will see a lot, though, is like RDA Centur-Ion. This is just how the RDA cards work, and I want to make sure that you have a good understanding of them. You do want to Bell the effect of Red Rising Dragon and negate the effect of Red Rising Dragon. They're going to be going for Crimson Resonator in their grave to reborn it, and Crimson has a pretty crazy effect to summon more from deck. So on the targeting from Red Rising, either Bishul, DD Crow the Crimson, or Bell the Red Rising, or negate the Red Rising. Just make sure that this does not resolve, please, when you're playing, do not let Red Rising resolve. Keep that in the back of your mind. That they attempt to go for a 10 or they attempt to go for a 12, drop rock, because a lot of times they're going to be going like Crimson Dragon, try to target like a Chenging and then go into like a Dissipator. And that's one thing where even on the target of the Crimson, you can go ahead and just throw rock. So that's really important too. Just make sure that you keep your opponent off as many bodies as possible. Ash the Soul Resonator so they can't get to the Bone Archfiend, and then use Ogre onto Crimson Gaia, or if you're worried about like spot removal and a Reborn, you can just hit Red Zone by itself as well, which is also a really solid hit. Now, as for Centur-Ion, you're going to go ahead here and Bell the Primus. This card's really good, but it adds to Engrave as well, so you can go ahead and just Bell that effect. Ash the Primera or hit the Primus, it doesn't matter, either or. Whichever one you see first, I'm probably just throwing Ash on because this deck is really behind, and a lot of times they don't draw enough engine because they don't have enough starters. So if you hit the first thing, sometimes they just pass. Like if they use Trudea to go ahead and spell trap itself, or they have Trudea in the spell trap zone, they try to bring it up, you could just Ogre that then. A lot of times you want to make sure that you're using it when it's trying to go back to the spell and trap zone, and then you Ogre it, and it's really insane. A lot of times too, like their hands are just going to have like Trudea and hand traps, right? So they go normal summon Trudea effect, you Ogre it, they'll pass. So that's really important. And then the Primera, if they're trying to bring it up from the spell and trap zone, that's when I would go ahead and Ogre it. Other than that, you can hit like the field spell, but the field spell is a little awkward. You only really can hit that if that's like the first thing that they do because of the clause on the card to save itself from destruction. So make sure that you do keep that in mind. You're realistically going to hit Ogre onto like a Trudea or a Primera if the Trudea is on board or if the Primera is in scale. I really like negating the Primus as soon as it's summoned 100% of the time, just because Emblem Oath is really crazy, and if you get that in rotation, then Atri gets a draw as well. So that's where draw is a little bit better in this match. It's not fantastic, but it's okay. Just being able to make sure that your opponent's on as minimal resources as possible. But if your opponent is going for Auxilia first, just go ahead and stop the Auxilia. Make sure that they don't get to whatever they need at that point because it's just a free add. And then also Auxilia is going to be able to place one back into the spell trap zone, and that's something that you just don't want to happen. So almost always I want to go ahead and stop the Auxilia, but if I have the chance to early stop like a Primus, I'm probably just going to go ahead and stop that too. Now, as for Labrynth, you can go ahead and DD Crow the rollback target. So if they go rollback target like Big Welcome and Grave, you can go ahead and just DD Crow the Big Welcome, and the rollback just won't resolve, which is really nice because the target's gone, it checks on resolution. You can Bell or Ash Big Welcome. That's just going to be 110% what you want to go for. That's what gets you to Lovely, and that's going to be the hand rip or the board rip, which is really annoying to deal with. So just shut this down as soon as possible, and then go ahead and hit the Ariana with a Veiler, an Imperm, or a Mourner. That's going to be also fairly good. A lot of times too, we'll see the Ariana just get special summon, so Mourner becomes a little bit better. We're seeing a lot of people tech in Mourner now. I don't love it. I know people are playing it, but it's not like the greatest hand trap. But I would just be on Veiler and Imperm. Still a lot better as far as right now goes. Now, as for Marincess, this was at the regional yesterday. There's quite a few actually, which is pretty crazy. But I want to make sure that you don't lose to a older deck if you just don't know where to hand trap it, right? So Nib on the end board is perfectly fine. You can just wait for Argonaut to hit the board and then just go bam. Like, it's so good. DD Crow onto Coral Triangle. You want to make sure you hit this out of their graveyard preemptively. Card's very strong for follow-up. Just get rid of it immediately. You can either do that or just hit the Blue Slug's target, which is also good because it just adds like the Seahorse back from grave to hand, then they just special the Seahorse. So that's another way to make sure that you take your opponent away from extenders. You also just want to make sure that you Bell the effect of Coral Triangle. Again, you want to make sure your opponent's not summoning out free links for no reason. That's the scariest thing to happen, especially because the second Anemone goes to the grave, they get back into their card. And these are things that we just need to cut off as soon as possible. Ash on Dive is really strong. You can Ogre the Battle Ocean, and this is probably one of the most important hits in the deck. You do not want your opponent having access to Battle Ocean. Card's very scary. It makes their Argonaut huge. And, you know, if they do end up using Crystal Heart, which is not common, it makes their Extract Monster Zone Link unaffected, which is pretty cool. It's a tower. Battle Ocean just causes a lot of problems. You want to get rid of it as soon as possible. And then last but not least, the most important stoppage is just Marincess Sea Angel gets hit with any hand trap you have under the sun. Ash, Mourner, Veiler, Imperm, whatever you got, throw it at Sea Angel, and you'll be able to beat this deck fairly quickly. With Nib, you're probably just waiting till end of main, to be honest with you, because at that point, you're just trading for the Sylvia anyways, and it's not going to matter too terribly much. That's one thing where Nibiru is going to be pretty mid in this matchup. It's okay. It's a lot better for like crackback when your opponent's trying to like break into your board, I feel like, because when they start going through like all the different options you have and then you drop rock afterward, it's pretty strong, especially if you're a deck that has a lot of different grind game, especially later on. You have like a follow-up ice or something, right? I really do like rock in general right now, but it's really going to depend on this matchup, usually the end of main. Now, for a bestial play, you want to get rid of the Sylvia in the grave, or if they put a different fusion in the grave, go ahead and get rid of that so they can't return the hollow to their hand and keep using it. That's one thing where you want to make sure you cut off access to that as soon as possible as well. You can go ahead and bestial away the names in grave when they try to return like a synchro. So if they go like one of their names, target a synchro to return it, that will get returned, and then you'll banish the name from grave and put them on no resources, which is really strong too. So Bestials are very important in this matchup. I really do like them a lot. Make sure that you have them. You can Bell or Ash Wanted Poster. I'm probably just going to use like Bell on a Wanted Poster, and I'm always just going to Ash the Elzet. Elzet's just broken. This card is very good. Make sure that you are Ashing Elzet. The card's really strong. Ogre onto Deception, of course. We don't want our opponent to get a free Omni for no reason. And then Valor Imperm right onto the Sylvie, because that's going to be the #1 play starter for your opponent as well. Now, as for Dark World, Lancia is going to be very important because your opponent's going to want to loop Gates of the Dark World as much as possible. They even use Zephyros to bounce it back to use it again. And you can't use it under Lancia, so that's pretty strong. You also can go ahead and droll this matchup, you ought to win. You can Ash the Genta, you will win pretty quickly. Or you Bestial or Bell away the Ceruli to make sure that your hand is not about to get ripped. Otherwise, just make sure that you're always using Ogre onto Gates of the Dark World. It's really funny because either you see the other Gates of the Dark World hit the board, or you see your opponent hitting Admit Defeat. Now, as for Flu, definitely not around as much as ever right now, which is amazing to see. We hate Flu, and you know, it's just one of those decks where you see it and you're like, oh no, like Featherstorm, all the awful shifters, and just the crazy cards this deck gets to play. I'm not a fan of this deck. I have never been a fan of this deck. This deck is just awful to play against, but let's make sure that you don't lose to it, right? If your opponent just like raw normal summons Robina, nothing else, you're always going to hit that with Ash 100% of the time. That means their hand's awful. If they start their turn with Advent of Adventure, banish one, I'm also ashing that immediately because that means that they have no starter and they really need to get to one, right? That could also mean that they have like a bad bird in their hand, so like a Stree that doesn't really do anything, or like a Talkin, and they really need to get to a different bird, so they go for a map there. So you're always just hitting that immediately. A lot of times you're hitting like whatever pot card they have, so if they go like start a main, activate Extra, or like Prosperity, I'm probably just hitting that. So just keep that in mind that Ash is pretty versatile in this matchup, and it's usually like the first thing that you see, realistically. You're always going to Ogre on map. That just means that this deck has only one play they can do, and it just has to be a normal summon. Again, if it's one of the birds you don't want to see as well, it's pretty awkward. Even if it's just like Eglin, right, and they don't have a different bird in hand, they go normal Eglin, add Empen, pass, right, because they can't summon it. So that's pretty awkward. So you always want to make sure that you go ahead and Valor Imperm the Eglin, because this is what's going to get to one of the larger birds, which is a problem all in itself, because let's say they open all small birds and you stop the Eglin, they have no big bird. It doesn't do anything, right? So that's really important as well. Now, as for Memento, there's a couple different ways that you can use Nibiru against this deck, and it really does depend. I know that a lot of times you'll see people try to go for like SP with like a combined creation or what have you, and it's really going to be a judgment call as to what you want to do. If your opponent is just trying to end on things like the fusion that pops and then have like combined creation, I'm probably just going to attempt to drop rock anyways end of main. I'm always going to try and threaten the board as much as possible to get my opponent to use as many cards as possible, right? So at that point, Nibiru, it's going to be pretty okay in this matchup. It's not like insane, but it's an okay card. You'll be able to bait some kind of interaction with it. Now, the important interaction here is you want to stop Gaddock. Bestial this thing out of the graveyard or Bell it. Do not let it come back to the board. It is very problematic, and a lot of times it's going to add back like Sleepy, and then Sleepy can go ahead and combo even further, so make sure that you stop the rotation of Gaddock as soon as possible. Ash Bone Party, this doesn't really change. The card's really good, especially if you have like Valor Ash and you like Valor a Darkblade, they chain Bone Party and you Ash Bone Party. Could just be the match right there, so keep that in mind. It's a very strong play. Using Ogre, though, on the field spell is going to be really good. Be able to stop recursion, and then also be able to stop your opponent getting back to their spells and their traps. And then last but not least, you always hit the horse with anything under the sun. Your Ash, Veiler, Imper, Mourner, whatever you got. You want to make sure you hit the horse. Do not let the horse resolve. Now the next up is going to be Fiendsmith Tenpai. This deck is absolutely absurd. We're still seeing a lot of the OTKs come out of the Tenpai cards. So this is going to be no different from earlier. A lot of times the Fiendsmith engine is going to be hand-trapped all the same. Some matchups it doesn't matter as much. This is going to be very similar to like the Ryzeal deck in the terms of the Fiendsmith engine doesn't matter that much if you can handle like a Caesar or a Desiree. A Desiree can get dealt with by just an Ogre. So that's really important to know as well. And you have a lot of different options to go ahead and deal with things like Desiree or Caesar, especially in cards like Eclipse, which you should be maining or siding 3 of that card right now. The card's absurd. Or even cards like Ulti Slayer. There's so many outs to them right now. So if you're pretty confident that you can deal with the Fiendsmith cards, don't interact with the Fiendsmith cards, especially against Tenpai. Let them just resolve. Unless, again, your card is imperm and they try to make, like, a Desiree. Unless you had talent, then you just win anyways when you proc the Desiree when you try to imperm the detonator on your turn. You really want to make sure that if you are interacting with the Tenpai cards that you're doing so by hitting the summoning with the Ogre or just ashing summoning. Very rarely right now are you ever going to see them activate summoning and then normal summon Hydra because the odds of seeing that are very low. You'll usually see your opponent just go like normal summon Hydra. I'm shutting off Hydra 10 out of 10 times. I'm trying to hit it. If your opponent just calls battle, you know they have Kaiman, and then you just ash the Kaiman, no problem, that's fine. Right now I'm seeing a lot of players though get Kaiman to their hand, make a Transcendent, and just call battle, of course, because then you can't respond and then you just auto die. So I'm trying to interact in the main phase as much as possible and make sure that you cut that off from being an option. The other thing that can make your opponent really freak out is if they go for Bident to revive the Chandra. It doesn't really matter what they're reviving, but usually it's Chandra, and you bell the Bident, they're in a very awkward position because they don't have the same number of bodies that they were hoping that they would have. So it makes things fairly awkward to go for game at that point. So bell onto the Bident target or even DD Crow onto the Bident target is both very strong and something that you really should consider. Now, as for Purrely, this deck is definitely very interesting. This is something where if you haven't played against it in a long time, I want to make sure that you really know what to do versus this. You do Ogre, my friend. You do go ahead and stop any hand trap that you have against the Lily, because the Lily is going to add the problematic cards like the Field Spell and the My Friend. But the real interaction here is going to be with Purrely Noir. If your opponent has Noir on board and they use a quick play spell, you want to chain whatever you can chain. So if you have Ash, you let everything else resolve, and then they activate a quick play spell while Noir's on board, and you Ash the spell. And this prevents your opponent from being able to go Noir set the trap to be able to go up into the larger Noir, which is the actual problem. So let's say that you Ash the effect of the quick play, which shuts down the win effect of the Noir to go ahead and set the trap. The next thing that they do is activate a quick play spell again. Now, this is where you have like a Bishul in hand, and you like chain the Bishul and target a lighter dark in the grave, just to make sure that your opponent cannot set the trap. Because again, it works like Lady Labrynth, where they need no response from you to be able to use it, otherwise it misses timing. So make sure that you save your interruption for when there's an Purrely Noir on the board. Otherwise, you are hitting the My Friend, you are hitting the Lily, and you need to do this because, again, you don't want them to get to things like the Field Spell, because that's also pretty obnoxious. Now for Mermail, I did blank out the Bishul here. I usually put like DD Crow for a different example, and that's going to be DD Crow onto the Bodyguard once it's sent off Prince, because it is sent for cost. So on the same chain, when they send the Bodyguard for cost, if you DD Crow the Bodyguard, it'll be in a new location for resolution. So when it goes to a new chain, it's no longer in the same location. It will not get a window to activate, which is very important. So either DD Crow the Bodyguard on the send cost, or Ash the effect of Bodyguard on a new chain. You don't want this card to resolve. You do, however, want a Veiler Imperm onto Pike effect, Pike is going to be very important for this deck to be able to get through their plays. You don't want them to get to the Abyss Stride, I believe the name is. It's the level 3 that just allows you to go into Coelacanth and what have you for no reason. So stop the Pike for sure. Stop the Bodyguard. You can use Nibiru onto the Bahamut Shark if it is at 5 summons. A lot of times it will be at like 4 summons, but I haven't really seen those combos come up too often. Usually it is like the 5th summon. So if you have to drop rock there, then just do it because you don't want your opponent to be able to get to things like the Totally Awesome, which is going to make your life not totally awesome in that game. So that's one thing where you also want to make sure that you have Bell or Ogre for the Anemone. Do not let your opponent extend further than they need to. If they are on like the Swap Frogs, which isn't really that common, they can go for like the Ice Barrier, which gets to the Freezing Chains, which gets you back to 2/2s on the board, and you can get a Toad that way. So definitely very threatening when you play against this deck, but have your Drolls. I've had like nothing on the side that really did anything for this deck because I had everything already in my main deck, and I put in the Lancias, and I actually shut off my opponent from using Minstrel, which was really cool. So sometimes you have to do what you got to do against this deck to make sure your hand doesn't get looped. But it is very cool to make sure that you know a lot of these interactions. These are going to be the most important interactions you have versus this deck. Ostinato is considered all one effect, so you actually can Bell or Ash this card, which is pretty crazy and a little absurd, but you can. You can also Ogre the Couplet, which I think is the most important interaction beside Valor or Imprim onto Botcha. Botcha does say that like your fusions can't be negated, but it's the same thing as like blanking the card by itself will turn that effect off. So Valor Imprim onto Botcha is very, very important, but also so is Ogre onto Couplet to deny your opponent access to Concerto. You can Ogre onto the Link too because they have to summon to the zone that it points to. So that's also very important to just go ahead and clear it. So at that point, if you have like Nibiru in hand, and it's not like that great in this matchup, but that's another spot where you can go ahead and just like nib because your opponent needs to summon to those arrows, which is very important. I do like the Bistral here banishing out like a Soprano. It could be for the Maestra as well if they try to like add that back. So that's something where you really want to make sure that, you know, again, if they have like Shapina in the grave and they try to get it back with like the Soprano, you can go ahead and get rid of that. If they try to bring back like Soprano with the effect of Botcha when it goes to grave, you can go ahead and get rid of Soprano. I try to keep my opponent off of these cards as much as possible, especially things like Soprano that allow them to go ahead and fusion again. So that's always going to be problematic. Keep your opponent away from as many materials as possible, especially by getting rid of the Shapina. You take them away from a Maestra, which means that they won't be going to the Etoile anytime soon, which is going to be very important for your gameplay moving forward. Now, as for Dinomorphia, this is more of a random one, and I'm not going to cover this for too long, but onto their Frenzy or the Domain, you want to make sure that you do Ash these trap cards. They're both very strong, being able to get to their Kentrigina, which gets them to Rexterm, but you also can just like Ogre Rexterm, which is really strong. You really want to Lancia them on their turn if you want to interact with them, because the traps do banish to like protect them, which is really important too. The Rexterm is really annoying. It's a skill drain, but you can also add it with something like Book of Eclipse, which is hilarious, and it just makes the deck not so great, obviously. The deck is really obnoxious to deal with, but cards like Book of Eclipse are very, very strong in this matchup. Definitely go ahead and using something like Abyssal to get rid of the Dinomorphia names in the graveyard, because they do float back into each other if they do blow up. That's something where you want to make sure that you cut off as much recursion as possible, and then also just use the Valor Imperm onto Theresia, and then if you do have a moment in your opponent's turn where you want to use an effect, you could try to like Valor a Rexterm, or you could just hold the Imperm for your turn and try to hit the Rexterm. There's a lot of different ways you can out this, also like Super Poly, but no one's really playing that card right now. But at the end of the day, the deck isn't that relevant, but it does see play at YCSs, which is pretty crazy, and it does like not bad, right? So make sure that you are aware of what this deck does moving forward, and make sure that you beat Dinomorphia. So I have a question mark over Nibiru on this matchup, because like Nibiru cooks, it really does, but like you also have to realize like there's a lot of different lines that your opponent can go for, and it really depends where they're at in their combo, right? Because you don't want to nib too early to where there's too many resources still in their grave and they're going to be able to do other things. If you see 2 4s hit the board and then you're worried about like a Time Thief Redoer, you can either wait for the Redoer to activate too, because at that point your opponent will use the effect and then you'll use Nibiru and then the Redoer just won't resolve. or if they're on like Bahamut Shark, you can go ahead and just hit before they use the effect. There's a lot of different spots for Nibiru. I like it into this matchup. I think that it's very smart. A lot of times when I'm playing Tearlament, I will leave a name on the board on purpose to make sure that I don't lose to Rock, but I'm not everyone, and the matchup can be very, very different because the builds vary a lot. So it's going to take a lot of heads-up knowledge in this matchup to make sure that you know exactly what the standard is for tier at the time. I would definitely say that if you're looking at like an end of main phase play, or you see your opponent trying to set up like a Kaleido Heart, I might go ahead and hit them there with a Nibiru, because I don't want them to be able to be like, oh cool, Kaleido effect, bring it back, right? And that's one thing where sometimes your opponent will go ahead and preemptively pop their own Kaleido so they can get to that value, and then you hit them with Nib, and it's like, wow, like that sucked. It's going to take a lot of heads-up knowledge to use Nibiru in this matchup. There are a lot of other hand traps that do a lot better though. The Bishals obviously hit any of the names, you're good as gold there. That's one thing that you really want to make sure that you are doing. Bell onto the Vamp effect, or you can just Bell one of the names as well. Again, very strong. A lot of times they're chain blocked though, so not always the best opportunity, but you can give it your best shot. But the Vampire resolving here is going to be pretty crucial to stop, because you don't want your opponent A, milling cards, and B, getting a free summon. So that's pretty crazy, especially when it's like a Fenrir, right? And they're able to add like tier cash. Negating the Bahamut Shark is going to be very important as well. And then Ash on Unsteady, or just Ogre the King Sark. Make sure your opponent just does not play with these cards, because they're so very strong. Now, as for Voiceless Voice, this deck is still in and out of the format. This is something where you can go ahead and use a Bishal or DD Crow to go ahead and just banish the low when they try to bring it back after they ritual summon. Or you can preemptively just banish away the Saphira to make sure that your opponent can't ritual summon, right? That's also very important. I really like to use Bell onto the effect to add off the Saphira or Ash. The deck doesn't really play like pre-prep or anything anymore. A lot of them are trying to use like the Ryzeal cards and like other supplementary engines, like even the Nadir Servant package. So you could go ahead and just negate something like the Maximus, or if you know the Maximus is about to come down, you could just Bishal away the Garura that they send. That's also a very strong play, because you put your opponent on a very awkward situation where they already use Nadir Servant, you get rid of the Garura, that Maximus is dead in hand. So that's another really strong line. And again, it really depends on how your opponent opens, because if you play against this deck before, you know there's like 1 of 4 opens they could have. So at that point, you kind of have to gauge what they're doing, and you'll know when to use your hand trap at that point. But these are the different scenarios that I'm talking about now, so when you see it happening, you know exactly what to do. Also, Ogre onto Barrier. I like stopping this card. This card's really obnoxious. You could hit Blessing, but I would always say just hit Barrier, because it never ends well usually when you let the Barrier resolve to get the Saphira, which gets them to the Skull Guardian, which is going to be the Ritual, and just things that you don't want to see happen. And then if your opponent like uses the Trias to tribute a Diviner and Special a low, or they summon a low, Veiler, Imper, Mourner, I like to stop this because, again, I like to stop the Barrier, and that's going to be the most important for me, at least, to make sure that I can target their monsters. Now for Goblin Biker, the Nibiru and the Bishal here, they're like okay. That's why I haven't like blinked them out. They're fine. If you wait till like end of main to really interact with them, I probably wouldn't even care too much to use something like a Bishal until end of main, especially if it was like a Magnemut, because at that point I'm just going end phase Magnemut, Magnemut, grab Jerusalem, summon both, and then just dealing with the board from there, right? So that's really good. And then Nibiru, just end of main, just punish them for overextending, which is also really strong. Again, they're like okay cards. They're not going to be like a specific spot. They're just going to be there to gain advantage as much as possible for you. I really do like the Ash onto the Grand Entrance or onto the Gabanga. You can go ahead and bell the effect of the Grand Entrance Engraved to add something back to their hand, especially if they're trying to go for like the Dug Charger. The card's absolutely absurd, so you want to make sure that you just cut off access to it. I also really like using Ogre onto the effect of Gabanga on board. It will still search, but it gets rid of a monster that has Xyz materials, which is very important because you don't let your opponent extend for no reason. The deck extends when there's materials available. Keep that in mind. So the more materials that you can cut away is the more resources that you take away from your opponent. It's kind of like thinking about how even life is a resource. Sometimes the materials can be a resource in a deck, and that's what this deck feeds off of. So get rid of the materials, get the win. And then just throw any hand trap you have at Dug Charger. You don't want them to be able to get any spell or trap they want, right? That's just problematic. Next one up here is Mimighoul. So Mimighoul is really frustrating to play against. I can't even lie. This deck is pretty crazy. I like this deck a lot, especially as a budget option. So if you're looking for something to play right now that can play Shifter and it can make an impact in a room, Mimighoul is probably your deck. Now, you can bell the effect of Dungeon to add, because it can add from Grave. You also want to make sure that you're ashing Maker. Maker is the craziest card in this deck. I swear, the card's actually just absurd. I like this card a lot, but again, under Shifter and then dealing with this and having monsters on your own board, and then if you flip them up, it's a really bad time. Like, read over Dungeon real fast and tell me how ridiculous it is when you have a monster on your board. It's kind of crazy. You also can use Ash defensively, and then just ash the room on your turn to make sure that your opponent can't get things going and really stop you even further and extend further on your turn. Because, you know, that sounds like old Tearlament, which is my favorite. But interaction's interaction, and this deck has a lot of it. You also can just go ahead and ogre the dungeon, because it is an ignition effect. It's not just on activation, which is strong. And then any hand trap you have, just throw out the dragon. Make sure your opponent can't just add what they need to, especially get to Maker, because that card's very, very good. Now for Ritual Beast, is a deck that we're all tired of seeing, and I saw it at the regional a couple times yesterday, and it was all over the Master Duel Duelist Cup top 10, which is pretty crazy. The deck itself is still pretty ignorant. Most of the times, you just want to have a Nibiru or a Lancia, and you're absolutely cooking this matchup. The other really important interaction here is literally throwing any hand trap under the sun that you have at Banshee. You want to hit Banshee, you do not want to get Protoss locked in this deck. It is unfortunate when you do. Do not get Protoss locked if you don't have to. You can also ash the effect of the Lara when it's banished and they don't get to summon from deck. Usually they go for something like Iconahawk, of course, because that card's going to be able to get them to anything else they want. You can bell the effect of the Tamer Lara or the Zephyrin Pelika, of course, to be able to bring something back to the board and keep extending that way. Or just go ahead and ogre the Inheritance. The card's really good too, just making sure that they get more extension. And that's something I want to shut down as soon as possible with this deck. But if you do open Lancia or Nibiru, the Nibiru is just going to be like on summon of Protoss, then I would drop it. If you have nothing else, and they will just go to Protoss, right? So you can just go ahead and drop Nibiru then. Otherwise, if you don't see Protoss, which is weird if you don't, I would probably just wait until end of main. But card is very strong, card is very good. You want to make sure you have one of these two, and you'll be just fine against this matchup. Now, as for Branded, this is a matchup where you want to make sure that you still are understanding what's going on here, because, again, Branded is still around, but is not really doing too much. But the second we get any kind of relevant support for this deck, I feel like it's going to be kind of scary again. Remember, there are other targets for Albion besides just the Nightmare that got banned, and then also we have the new Lad Dragon, which is really absurd. I think the card's very, very strong. So this deck can still put up quite a fight. You want to make sure that you bell the effect of Albion defensively on your own turn, or you can also defensively bell the Branded in Red on your own turn, or you can go ahead and DD Crow or Bishul the target of Branded in Red to make sure that your opponent is not able to extend further and summon out like another Mirror Jade or a Lad, right? You don't want any of that to happen. The other thing too is if your opponent does summon like a Fallen of Albaz, use the effect and pitch a card, you can ogre that too, which is really strong. And make sure that your opponent is just going to lose value and you're not going to have your monsters threatened. The other thing is that you want to make sure that you banish the Albion out of the grave before the end phase. So DD Crow, Bishul, whatever you have, get rid of it. Make sure that they can't use the effect. But alternatively, if they use the Albion effect and they have only one Albaz in grave, you could take the chance and go ahead and just banish the Albaz in grave, because then there's not a whole lot that they can summon, because they need Albaz for a lot of it. And you could put them on, you don't have one in hand. If they do, that's a little unfortunate, but if they don't, then they're at a really awkward spot that doesn't really do a whole lot. Ash Branded Fusion, that pretty much goes without saying. Ogre on the effect of Cart to Fuse, because at that point they can't get to Grand Guignol unless they have another Cartesia, which is really unlikely. And then any kind of negation onto the Albion I really like too. Just another way to go ahead and shut this down as soon as possible and make sure that your opponent can't go like Albion into Lubellion and then go Lubellion effect, shuffle back to make Mirror Jade, and then bring back the Lubellion, which is really annoying to see. Usually they'll still get to like Lost, but you don't necessarily care about Lost at that point. As long as you can get rid of the Albion, it's perfectly fine for the Lost to be on board. Now, as for Frog Spright, which is just going to be the most common here, you're going to go ahead and bell the Freezing Chain so they can't go to 2/2s into a Toad. Which is going to be really unfortunate for you if that does resolve. Usually it's like swap Frog, dump the Ice Barrier, get this, bring it back, make Toad. That's something where you just want to cut that off as soon as possible. Ash onto starter. Of course, you don't want your opponent to go anywhere near the Spright cards and be able to get so much extension going. And then have any kind of negation or an ogre for Spright, because it works like duo drive where it activates, and if it resolves, it'll detach material. And if it gets ogred, it can't detach material, therefore the card does not resolve, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, Horus Orcust. This is a deck that we've been seeing pop up quite a bit. You can go ahead and just bishel out any of the pieces engraved that you see that are problematic. Usually it's going to be something like a Harp Horror or like an Orcust Nightmare that's sitting engraved. You can bell the effect of Zombie Vamp or just negate Zombie Vamp. This is the card that you absolutely want to shut down as soon as possible. And very much so like Tier, you want to Ash Imsteady or Ogre the King Sark. You can Ash the Harp Horror if that's how they start. But if they start Imsteady, that Ash is getting thrown so fast. I'm making sure that Imsteady is not resolving, right? That's the #1 priority for me. As for Mitsurugi, I just talked about this not too long ago. You want to make sure that you negate the King of the Feral Imps before the effect happens. So as soon as it's summoned, go ahead and drop a Mourner, a Veiler, or Imperm so they can't just like chain prayer and get a just insane amount of advantage from it. You also can go ahead and just shut down the Saji immediately when it hits the board, because you do not want this card to resolve either, being able to get to the Ritual spell. Now, as for Ash and Bell, use it onto Amino or the Prayers. Probably hitting the Prayers with it, honestly. You can hit the Amino if they go ahead and get rid of it and try to bring it back. Either it'll stay engraved for either of these effects and not be a problem, right? You can do it defensively with like a Bell if they try to bring it back during your turn to blow up your board and make you discard if you want to do anything. But a lot of times I'm just going to try to stop the play from happening and go ahead and just Bell or Ash the Prayer, because the Prayer is the real issue here, and that's something that you make sure that this does not resolve. Now, Nibiru is going to be onto the duo drive here. It's the same thing with the Ogre. Usually, if you see Mitsurugi, it's going to be with Ryzeal. Now, there's going to be other variants like Ogdoadic and whatnot, but usually it'll be a Ryzeal variant. So you want to make sure that you do have the negation for the duo drive. Now, this is going to be pretty common that your opponent will Mitsurugi combo first. If they start doing it afterward, that's a little iffy. Usually, I would say that it's going to end up being first, but it really depends on what line they're starting with. But at the end of the day, you do want to make sure you have some kind of stoppage for duo drive. The second that you find out that it is Ryzeal, you want to hold whatever you can for the duo drive. Do not let this card resolve. And then when your opponent tries to bring back the Omnino, you can always just banish it and make sure that that's just not going to be a problem in that game, because usually it's just a one of. Sometimes people run like 2 of it, but a lot of times it's just a one of. Now, as for Crystal Beast, a deck that you don't really see too often, but it's something that will pop up. Any kind of negation that you have for Sapphire Pegasus, you want to make sure your opponent doesn't get to the Crystal Beast Rainbow Dragon, which you can go ahead and Ash when they banish it for cost, so they can't just summon one out of deck for no reason. You also can Ash the Crystal Bond. I like hitting the Rainbow Dragon because, again, it's just getting your opponent like too much advantage, right? You also can Bell the Golden Rule. Card's pretty crazy, allows you to do quite a lot of pretty ridiculous things, but also being able to get that Reborn there, you can go ahead and just shut that down completely with the Bell, which is going to be absolutely fantastic. And then, of course, you want to use the Ghost Ogre onto the Rainbow Bridge of the Heart. The Conclave is really not that common to play. A lot of times it's going to be a different engine build where they're trying to go for different things. Before it was like Snake Eyes, and now it's just going to be more so control-y, but not necessarily Conclave. I'm probably hitting the Rainbow Bridge over anything. If you need to hit the Conclave and you see that it's there, then just hold the Ogre for that, because that's going to be a lot of interruption on your own turn as well. But I like hitting the Bridge of the Heart with it. I think that's the best spot for your Ogre. Now, as for Plant, this one's going to be really quick. Just using any negation that you have onto the Jasmine. Of course, we know this Jasmine's broken. It's one of the last Link 2s that are still living from the Needle Fiber set, which is crazy. Jasmine's been crazy, but the deck doesn't really do anything, so unless you're in Europe, right? But the deck doesn't really do anything. So that's something where you don't necessarily have to be worried about it, but if you do play against this deck, just know you hit the Jasmine. When they tribute a monster to summon, you Ash it. When they summon it and they try to use the effect, you hit it with Veiler and Imperm, and on summon, you Mourner it. Everything goes to the Jasmine. You can go ahead and Bell the effect of Petal if it's your end phase and your opponent has nothing on board and they try to get back into the grind game. You can go ahead and just shut that off completely right there, which is really nice as well. So that's just like a later grind game note that you want to have. Ogre on Con when they try to set something like Sheet, very strong. Con's very annoying to deal with, and then you can always just go ahead and Bell the effect of Blend too. while we're at it, why not just talk about Phantom Knight? This is another deck that just has so many different engines. Again, I'm prioritizing the Horus engine over anything, so Ash and Ogre. If your opponent activates like Enchantress, you can Bell or Ash it, of course. This is the card that can add the Erratic Armors here from Grave or deck, so that's one thing that you can Bell or Ash. I like the Vampire stoppage here as well, of course. Just being able to mill and then summon is really broken because this deck really cares about being in the graveyard. That's why this deck always had Droplet in it, because you could send your entire hand to the graveyard, negate your entire opponent's board, and just combo from there, right? So it's very strong. The other thing too is you want to get rid of things like the Ancient Cloak is just your best searcher in the deck right now. And then last but not least, you want to just throw everything you have at the Rusty Bardiche. Do not let your opponent combo off for no reason. Don't let them get to Fog Blades and more extenders for no reason, right? It's just unnecessary. This is going to be a very good stoppage point. You can hit the Torn Scale, but I'm probably just waiting for Bardiche. This card's so absurd, and you just want to hit it as soon as possible. Now, as for Chimera, the Azamina build is going to be really popular post-Suda, so this is something that you want to make sure that you're on top of. There's a lot of places that your Bell can land. I personally really like it onto Chimera Fusion because your opponent doesn't get the second Fusion, which is really nice. But at the end of the day, you can go ahead and just hit the Phantom Beast effect in the grave to Reborn on your turn, so you don't have to worry about things like Diabel, which is always going to be a problem because at that point you have to like set everything for your hand. They get a free pop. It's really annoying. You also have cards like Tau that can bring it back, so you can go ahead and Bell the Tau as well. If you aren't necessarily worried about the Fiendsmith engine, then you can deal with that. But very similar to earlier, if you don't necessarily care about a Desiree or a Caesar, which a lot of decks don't really necessarily care that much about them, you can just wait for their engine. This is not something where you see this engine and you're like, I have to interact right now. Unless it's like Nibiru, right? Then you probably have to if you're worried about a Caesar. But most of the time, you can just like let these things resolve and be like, okay, like that's fine. Because at that point, you can just wait for their engine, and they can't Caesar or Desiree your Ash Blossom. But the other thing that I will say in this deck that is scary is if they summon a sequence, because it's not always going to be Desiree. It's going to be their other 6, and that's something where Mourner, Veiler, Imperm become a lot more premium when you hit the sequence. This is one of the few decks that can abuse sequence to do other things than just Desiree, right? So I would hit the sequence in this deck because I don't want to give my opponent a Baphomet for no reason, and a free send, and a lot of value. The Azamina cards will be in this, so Ogre onto Deception once they tribute. Of course, just get rid of it immediately. You don't have to worry about the Omni Negate. And Ash onto the Sword Knight, of course, because that's going to get them to like the Baphomet, and that card's going to be very, very strong. And then last but not least, one of my new favorite rogue decks in the game that will end up slowly moving up to tier 2 as people start figuring out what the deck does, and then hopefully breaks into, you know, maybe just outside of like top 10 contention. I like this deck a lot. I think that there's a lot of room for this deck to grow. But you want to make sure that you are going to throw Rock right when there's 2 5s on the board, so you don't have to worry about Nova or Infinity. That's something you can get rid of as soon as possible. Bell or Ogre onto the Cluster. Again, don't deal with this card. You don't have to. Just use one of these to clear it, because it will be annoying otherwise. Now, you can use the Ash for Smyger, or just use something like DD Crow to get rid of it, or you can just put your opponent under Lancia, and they have a really hard time. The other thing is that if your opponent has like a Tristalos and you know there's going to be a problem, you can just hold your Ash for when your opponent attempts to use Tristalos, and then you can just Ash the effect and you don't really have to worry about it. Same with like Ogre, they use the effect and then you can just like Ogre the card, and then they keep the body, which is fine because at that point they're not like summoning a Synchro on you, right? But it's still a really good spot to go ahead and just shut down as soon as possible. And then on the 5 over here on the right, underneath the Mourner, Veiler, Imperm, go ahead and shut this down. You don't want your opponent being able to dump 2 monsters for free. It's just so much value, and your opponent can do a lot with that. Now, that was a really long episode, and I do hope that you enjoyed that. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I love making content like this because I want to make sure that each and every one of you do the best that you can at every tournament that you're in. You have the most amount of fun and get the most amount of wins. If you haven't already joined my Twitch, Twitter, Instagram, or Discord, definitely go ahead and do so down below in the description as well. And I hope that you all have a wonderful night. I'll catch you all in the next video. Thank you.